Okay, so now we get to the Vietnam War. Um, the Vietnam War, first of all, some basic points to keep in mind as you approach it is to think of it in terms of the Cold War. It is part of the Cold War picture. Um, a few moments of brief background. I don't know how much you have from Global or Euro or whatever else, but just to sort of bring you back up to speed here. Myanmar, as it's called today, was Burma. Thailand was known years ago as Siam. And this whole area, what we call Vietnam today, and Laos here, and Cambodia, this was all French Indochina. The French had taken this as a colony years and years beforehand. And this is really remote background to this, but at the Versailles Peace Conference after World War I, remember that? One of the things that went on at the Versailles Peace Conference was a discussion of countries and their colonies, and some talk about the slow elimination of colonies and so on. That would not happen until after World War II with the United Nations. The United Nations used to have a thing called the Trusteeship Council. The UN has several bodies within it, and the Trusteeship Council was a method by which countries could sort of liberate in stages their colonies. But back in Versailles, in the peace conference then, Versailles was not just about ending World War I, it was about rethinking the world. And I mention it because a young Vietnamese communist revolutionary who had been influenced by Marx, who had been influenced by what had gone on with the Russian Revolution, by the name of Ho Chi Minh, showed up at Versailles with a delegation to try to politely talk the French into liberating their colonies in Southeast Asia. And the French didn't go along with it. Okay, then fast forward a bit to World War II. The Japanese invaded this area and actually held this area as part of the Japanese Empire during World War II. 1945, the Japanese withdraw. And when the Japanese surrendered and withdrew, they had to turn government over to somebody. And they turn it over to Ho Chi Minh, who is by this time based up near Hanoi in the north of the country, where the bulk of his support is. The French, with British help, in the meantime, return to Vietnam, primarily returning through the south, what is called Saigon, the capital down here. And the French reassert their authority over this whole area. This doesn't go down well, of course, and there is much rebellion and there's much fighting, and the French have to fight in order to maintain their colony, and they fight a losing battle. At the famous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French are really defeated, and the decision is made there to for the French to give up control of their colony and turn it over to a local government. At the time, it's just a nationalist revolt. It's just a revolution for Vietnam and Laos to be independent countries. We're not quite ideological yet. The French, as I said, are defeated, and so they decide, okay, they're going to give Laos their freedom, and they're going to give Vietnam their freedom, but who do they turn the government of Vietnam over to? Because you had a guy in the South named Bao Dai, who was the king or emperor of the South, and you had Ho Chi Minh in the North. So the country is split along the 17th parallel, North and South, so that a national referendum can be set up for the whole country to vote on what direction they want to go in and how they want to set up a government. The United States begins to get involved at this point. In 1954, and by the way, Vietnam had some importance, particularly to the French, because it does have some natural resources, particularly rubber, which again is a strategic resource for a lot of reasons. In 1954, when the French are defeated at the Dien Bien Phu, this agreement called the Geneva Accords is created to divide the country temporarily while the referendum is set up. It's at that time that Eisenhower first uses the term domino, what's called the domino theory. And this is another important phrase to know. Eisenhower, who's president, looks at this and says that the United States is not going to allow a communist takeover of Vietnam, even by local communists, if you will, by Ho, because, as he says, quote, when you have a row of dominoes set up, you knock over the first one, and what will happen to the last one is the certainty that it will go over very quickly. In other words, if North Vietnam goes to the communists, then South Vietnam will, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and before you know it, the whole of Asia will be communist. That's the domino theory. They're all going to fall down. So the United States refuses to go along with this national referendum in Vietnam. They back a southern government, which they claim to be the legitimate one. Now you get into some really controversial stuff, but basically, the king of South Vietnam, Bao Dai, is replaced in a very disputed election to this day by a guy named Ngo Dinh Diem, President Diem. Diem is an American-backed president who asserts his right to govern all of Vietnam. Of course, in the north, Ho Chi Minh doesn't recognize this, and so you have a fight between the north and the south. The Diem government was never all that popular, even in South Vietnam, for a number of reasons. First of all, the Diem family was large, and it was an extremely corrupt government. So each member of the family, the brothers, all got pieces of the economy of Vietnam. And Diem and his family were Catholic, which he kept trying to convince the Vatican and everybody else that Vietnam was full of Catholics. There were some Catholics in Vietnam. There had been missionary activity there since the 1600s. But the vast majority of Vietnamese were Buddhist and felt oppressed by some of Diem's policies. So he's got some political instability in South Vietnam. He also had North Vietnam attacking him. Both the North Vietnamese army attacking him, one country against another, and the Viet Cong, the VC as they were called by Americans, who were communist infiltrators in the South. So you have a war South Vietnam versus North Vietnam, and you also have the Viet Cong, who are South Vietnamese local communists fighting their own government down here so that Vietnam would be one communist country, and being supplied from the north. There was a thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which came from the north down through Laos and Cambodia back into South Vietnam to supply them. Okay. Now, the Vietnam War, obviously, it is a matter that you could spend forever studying, but to get you the most important parts. Eisenhower, this is in the 50s, so already in 54, Eisenhower is providing money, advice, and some CIA support to the Republic of Vietnam government in South Vietnam, the Diem government in South Vietnam. In the north, the communist government of Vietnam, North Vietnam, is receiving offers of support from both China and the Soviet Union. And in fact, in many ways, the North Vietnamese were closer to the Soviet Union than they were to China. You can see China borders them right here. And so the fear was that if they became a client of China, they would simply be annexed by China and lose their separate Vietnamese identity. The Vietnamese people are a different people ethnically, linguistically, and everything else from the Chinese, so they didn't want to sort of be taken over by China. So although, you know, all the communists are friendly together, theoretically, they're going to be closer to the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union is communist and supportive, but is less of a direct potential threat to them. So here you have communist-backed North Vietnam, American-backed South Vietnam, and Eisenhower is being supportive of the South. He doesn't get deeply involved in Vietnam, in part because it's a very complicated and difficult situation, and Eisenhower was reluctant to get involved in something that there was not a clear potential for victory in. Kennedy becomes president. During his inaugural address, he famously says that the U.S. would pay any price, bear any burden, and meet any hardship to assure the survival and the success of liberty. One can see that as a veiled reference in his inaugural speech to what's going on in Vietnam. The policy of Eisenhower, which was to supply money, advice, CIA help, and military involvement only in the sense of sending over military advisors. Kennedy continues that. Eisenhower had sent over about 900, 1,000 U.S. Army advisors over there, whose job, in theory at least, was just to train South Vietnamese troops. Kennedy decides to increase that involvement but keep it the same type of involvement. So he adds a larger amount of money that the South is going to get, more military aid in terms of equipment and supplies, and dramatically increases the number of advisors. As I said, when he took office, there were less than 1,000. By the time Kennedy is assassinated in 1963, there were about 16,000 American advisors in the South. Now, that's a pretty substantial number of guys. That's a lot of, quote, advisors down there. They're helping to train. We're not actually participating in the war in theory, but in fact, we're getting more deeply involved. There are indications, and you can't be hard and fast to this, so don't say anything hard and fast about it. You can say there are indications from things that have been released in recent years, records and telephone conversations and such, that Kennedy was starting to think about getting out of Vietnam. He, like Eisenhower, saw it and saw what a complicated, the word that was used often in the 60s of it, the quagmire, yeah, like a thick swamp that you get stuck in. You're trying to slog through it and you can't move your feet in it. They were afraid of getting stuck there in a situation that they really couldn't win. So there are indications that Kennedy was thinking about getting out, but he hadn't quite made a move yet. Then he's assassinated in the fall of '63. Lyndon Johnson becomes president. There are a lot of feelings about Johnson. He's a very controversial figure. Certain things need to be recognized, though. First of all, he was taking over from a president who had just been assassinated. Certainly, and Johnson was himself a very ambitious man. He didn't really like Kennedy at all, and he didn't get along with any of Kennedy's people. Kennedy had pulled him in as vice president because he knew he needed Johnson's support to carry the southern states. Kennedy, you know, was Catholic. There were a lot of people who would not vote for Kennedy because he was Catholic, and they were afraid of his Catholicism, that, you know, there's this oldest Protestant prejudice in America. He was from Boston. He was a Northerner. He was a progressive and all of this. So Kennedy pulls Johnson onto his ticket as vice president because Johnson will bring Texas with him and many of the southern states, the more conservative end of the Democratic Party. But there was never like a warm relationship between the two. They didn't like each other. They basically hated each other's guts. And Johnson didn't get along with anybody on Kennedy's staff. And a lot of people knew all of that. When Kennedy was assassinated, if Johnson had started making a whole ton of changes himself right away, it would have been viewed as him capitalizing on this national tragedy, betraying the legacy of our martyred president, etc., etc. So Johnson had to find a way to sort of continue Kennedy's policies and make them his own. The second, and so, by the way, nobody knew that Kennedy was thinking about pulling out of Vietnam. So if Johnson suddenly decided to pull out of Vietnam, that would be viewed as potentially betraying Kennedy's legacy. Okay. Second thing, right at the end of '63, after Kennedy's assassination, there was a coup in Vietnam. The generals got together, got rid of President Diem, executed him, and then you had a series of generals take over the country as self-proclaimed presidents. The third thing that was, so you had instability over there, and the American-backed government seemed to be in crisis. Third thing is the activity of the Viet Cong, the VC, those communists based in South Vietnam itself, but being heavily supplied from the north, was becoming more and more active. They were engaging in what we would call terrorist bombings all over Saigon, which was the main city in South Vietnam. Saigon, by the way, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City after the war. This is a map from after the war. So Johnson is looking at a government that's increasingly unstable there, yet it's American-backed, more and more communist terrorist activity, and the fact he had to carry on a president's legacy. So Johnson decides, rather than withdraw from Vietnam and rather than just maintain what was going on, to go more deeply into Vietnam. On August 4th, 1964, you had a thing called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Gulf of Tonkin is up here in North Vietnamese neighborhood. There were two American destroyers. A destroyer is a light battleship, smallish battleship. Two American destroyers were patrolling around up here. Now, the reason I call it an incident and the reason I'm hesitating is exactly what to say about this. It was reported by Johnson that the North Vietnamese had fired on these two American destroyers, and that the American destroyers were in international waters at the time. Let me get a map. Okay, here's a closer view on the Gulf of Tonkin. The ships involved were the Turner Joy and the Maddox, and they were routinely on patrol up here right off the coast of North Vietnam. I won't go into all the details of the incident. You can read that. Again, there's been a lot written about it online. The short version is this. While the Maddox was patrolling on August 2nd, a couple of North Vietnamese small boats, motor torpedo boats, very small boats, PT boats, came charging toward it. And there was fire exchanged. On August 4th, there was another similar incident in which fire was also exchanged. And as a result, retaliatory strikes, airstrikes, were ordered against some major targets. Now, the controversy here is this. First of all, there is much question as to whether that initial attack ever took place. There is reason to believe that, in fact, the Maddox was not attacked by anybody and was firing at non-existent ships. Second, even if the attacks took place, there is much question as to whether the ships were deliberately put there by Johnson in order to get the North Vietnamese to attack them so that they could then start a war, basically to draw them off sides. And third, even if the attacks did take place and the ships were there, if you will, legitimately, there's a great deal of question as to who fired first. This is important because this became the excuse for war. The second incident took place on August 4th of 1964. On August 5th, Johnson went to Congress asking for them to pass a resolution not to declare war on North Vietnam, which probably would have been impossible to politically to do, but rather a resolution authorizing the president to take, quote, all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The Gulf of Tonkin incident may or may not have ever actually taken place, but it was treated as sort of the Pearl Harbor of Vietnam. Johnson got his resolution. It was passed unanimously by the House, almost unanimously by the Senate, and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, as it's called, based on an alleged report of alleged aggression by North Vietnam, gave Johnson basically full authority to do whatever he wanted militarily in Vietnam. Important to know the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It shows up. Okay, so now Johnson has sort of thrown the dice, and he is committed. the war, the conflict in Vietnam, got worse and worse. The Viet Cong became even more active in local attacks down there. The government of South Vietnam, again, was a corrupt military dictatorship by this point. But Johnson decided to escalate the war militarily anyway. And he began shipping significant numbers of men. This is at the in middle of 1965. Significant numbers of men over to Vietnam. Significant numbers of planes. You had a lot of Navy planes based on carriers over there, and you had a lot of Air Force planes over there. Bombers, the B-52, which was an enormous, huge bomber that we used, dropped more, over the course of the war, dropped more tons of bombs on this little country than were used altogether in the Second World War. That's how much bombing went on. By 67, so a few years in, we had 500,000 American troops stationed in South Vietnam and patrolling the border, the demilitarized zone. And bodies started coming back. Between 65 and 67, which is still within Johnson's term, you had 16,000 American casualties. 16,000 American, I should say that 16,000 American deaths. A casualty can also be wounded, but 16,000 American deaths over there. So now the war is starting to become real to people. It's not 1,000 military advisors. It's not even 15,000 military advisors. Now it's 500,000 men, and you're starting to get funerals in hometowns across America for guys being killed in this war. 67, I keep talking 67 because 67 is the key date in the Vietnam War. In very early 1968, in fact, on the end of January 31, 68, you had the Tet Offensive. Tet, T-E-T. The Vietnamese, like the Chinese, follow, their own lunar calendar. Chinese New Year usually takes place in January, February sometime. The Vietnamese have their own similar calendar. And so the Tet, which is the Vietnamese New Year, took place that year on January 31. Now, up to this time, the word from Johnson had been a little more and we're going to win, a little more and we're going to win, a little more we're going to win, and we got them on the ropes, and we'll have the troops home by Christmas, and so on and so forth. When the Tet Offensive breaks out, January 31st, all over Vietnam, you suddenly have violence. The North Vietnamese, in a coordinated attack, make a huge incursion across the border. In South Vietnam, the Viet Cong come charging in, raiding villages and towns, and setting off terrorist attacks in Saigon, the capital. Over the next few days, you had 100 different cities, villages, and military bases all being simultaneously hit by the North Vietnamese. It was the turning point of the war, because even though the Americans wound up, quote, defeating the Vietnamese during the Tet Offensive, the fact that they were able to stage such a massive, powerful attack on us in the first place not only shocked the hell out of Americans, but also indicated that Johnson and the administration had been lying all along when they kept saying that, the phrase, quote, victory is just around the corner. The the heavy fighting and the heavy casualties really made people question the whole point of the war and question Johnson's honesty and reliability. It was at the same time as Johnson's popularity is beginning to really tank that you're beginning to see the anti-war movement really ramp up. In 1967, you had started to have very heavy anti-war protests, in part because of the draft. You have to remember that since World War II, we had never gotten rid of the draft. So every American boy, and it only applied to boys, every American boy knew that as they were graduating from high school, the following was true. First of all, if they got into any kind of trouble with the law, they were going in the Army. If you went to courts all across the United States, criminal courts, if a kid was 17, 18, 19, and was not in the military, and they got into some minor trouble, I don't mean, mass murder, but they got picked up on a drunk driving conviction, or got into a bar fight, or, the stupid little stuff that idiot kids get into, very, very often the court couldn't sentence you to the military, but they would offer that as the alternative. Here's your choice, son. We can either give you a criminal conviction and put you in jail for 6 months, and now you have a criminal record, or we will let you get out of that by putting you in the military, where they'll straighten you out. And it wasn't so much to trick the kids. It was really honestly believed that, as many people still believe today, hey, you got a son who's kind of drifting and kind of doesn't have his act together and kind of needs to get a little discipline in his life. Kindest thing you can do, put him in the Army, put him in the Marines, let him toughen up and learn how to be a young adult. So you had that. If you had a kid who wasn't getting into any kind of trouble and just a good kid, they knew that they were facing military service, that they could be picked up at any time after they hit 18 and called up for the draft. And even if you were going to college, you could get a student deferment. So if you were drafted, they would allow you to finish your college degree, they would allow you to finish your bachelor's degree, but then you went in. So you knew that you were going into the military one way or the other, whether you liked it or not. This didn't apply to every single boy. As I think I mentioned last time, the way it worked was your birth date was given a lottery number every year. So they would pick out of one fishbowl a birth date, and they would pick out of the other fishbowl a number. And then that became that date's number. And then they would figure out how many guys they needed this year in the military, and they would go down through however many numbers it took to fill that quota. So if your birth date drew a very high draft number, like 364, you had a very low chance of being called. Chances that they were going to need so many guys that they would have to use every birthday in the year, pretty low. But if your birth date got a high draft number, if you were number 10, you were going to be called. Then you would go down to your local draft board. So you were called up for the draft, and you'd go down to your local draft board, and you would be classified. Classification meant that they would interview you and give you a medical exam and decide what your draft status was. And if you were well, you're not going to have to know these for the test, but just so give you an example, if you were 1A, you were available for service, and that's what most guys were. If you were 1O, it meant that you were a conscientious objector. You had, which was a very difficult status to get. You had to prove to the draft board that you had had a long-standing, like lifelong, religious conviction against all violence. Not against this particular war, not something you discovered last week, not something you thought up philosophically. So basically you had to go in and prove that you were born and raised a Quaker or Amish or something, and I'm not joking about that. I mean, that was basically what you had to do. So you were 1A meant you were going to get pulled into the Army. 1O meant you were a conscientious objector, which was not looked up, was not looked upon well in society. Conscientious objectors, COs, as they went on, were kind of looked down upon. You could be 1AO, that is, one available objector. That meant that you were an objector to violence, but you would serve in the military. So basically, your active objectors, if you will, were your medics, things like that. All right, and those were all guys who went. If you were in the 2 or 3 category, and all of the ones, I should say, by the way, were people who were available for service in some way, except for 1Os. Although they might, there might be reasons why you're not taking them at the moment. So, if you were still in high school, you were 1S, one student. That meant you might have hit your 18th birthday, but you still have a few months to go in high school. So they would hold off till you were finished for that. The 2 statuses were deferments, mostly because of occupations. There were certain jobs that were considered so important that they didn't want to take you out of them. So if you were in a significant war job, if you worked in certain kinds of specialized plants, if you were an engineer who was helping to make weapons, you were more valuable there than you were holding a rifle in the infantry. That was the idea. And if you were a student, those 2S was the college student deferment, which again didn't mean you didn't serve. It just meant you put it off until you would finish college. The 3 categories were meant that you had that you had dependents. So if you were a father of a group of children, and the number of children you needed for a 3A deferment went up over the years, but if they depended upon you for their livelihood, or if you were the son of of parents who needed you to make money for them because they were too elderly or something, you could get that deferment. The 4 deferments were people who were not going to be drafted. So the most important of these were 4F. 4F meant you were not qualified for military service, and 4F really was a medical thing. So anyway, I know that's kind of complicated, more than you all wanted to know, but basically, if you were an 18-year-old guy, you knew that you could be called up, and you were either going to be sent off to serve, or you were going to be allowed to continue to study and then go off to serve, or you were going to be classified as 4F, which meant that you were medically unsuitable for military service. And the guys who had different medical conditions, they might not always be obvious. I mean, if you had a heart murmur, or something like that, it could be a problem. All right. Well, to take it back for a minute to why 67, 68, because every boy in America was subject to this, you had an awful lot of teenagers and college kids who were beginning to really protest this war. It was a war that Americans didn't understand. Most Americans couldn't find Vietnam on a map. They didn't really care about these little oriental-looking people over there. They didn't see why their money, tax money, should go for this. They didn't know why their brother, boyfriend, or they themselves should have to go over and risk their life for this concept of the domino theory and anti-communism. And there were a lot of young people who really were beginning to protest this. A lot of adults didn't buy that. Hey, you go over and serve. I served my time in Korea. This is something a man does. And there was a lot of patriotism and a lot of anti-communism. But in 68, when the Tet Offensive showed that this war was not going to be so easy to win, that this could drag on for a long time, and maybe Johnson had been screwing around with us and lying to us, there were people, I'm not saying everybody in America, but there were a lot of people who were sort of middle of the road and undecided, who started also saying, hey, maybe this Vietnam War thing is not such a good idea. So in 68, Johnson was up for re-election. And two guys came forward within his own party. And that was Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, the brother of John Kennedy, the assassinated president. Robert Bobby was from Massachusetts but had moved to New York and had run for Senate from New York, and so he was Senator Robert Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was considered to be extremely smart and much more progressive-minded, liberal, if you like, politically, than his brother. He was very much in tune with young people. He was very much pro-civil rights, and we're going to talk about civil rights in the next video. And he was... he had the Kennedy popularity with him, and he was against the war. The other guy was Eugene McCarthy. And Gene McCarthy, known as Clean Gene, was from Minnesota, and was a senator from Minnesota, like Johnson. Was not nearly as good-looking or as young-looking as Bobby Kennedy. Didn't have the same sort of pizzazz, but had the advantage of not having been part of the Kennedy cabinet, not being part of the Washington establishment. Remember, Bobby had been Joseph McCarthy, no relationship to Eugene, Joe McCarthy's counsel back during the McCarthyism era. He had dropped off that, but he had started there. And Kennedy, his brother, he had been his brother's attorney general. He had been John's attorney general. And John did not get as progressive on civil rights as people would like. And John had also been, initially involved in, had been part of the initial involvement in Vietnam. So Gene McCarthy, known as Clean Gene, was seen by a lot of people as being even more pure and more free from taint than Bobby was. Anyway, with Gene McCarthy entering and Robert Kennedy entering the race from the Democratic side to challenge Johnson in the primary, Johnson finally decides to throw in the towel. By March of 1968. So this is barely March 31st of 68. So it's really just barely 2 months after the disastrous Tet Offensive. Johnson Johnson announces that he is not going to run for re-election, as he says, and you can find the tape. He made he dropped this bomb on the country on television. He was giving a nationally televised address that night, in which he said, quote, "I have decided that I shall not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as president." It surprised everybody. I mean, it left everybody's jaw hanging. He did another couple of things which have been a little bit forgotten. The same day he did that he announced that he was not running for re-election, he also ordered a stop to the bombing of North Vietnam, so the stop of the air war. He halted further troop increases in Vietnam. The commander in Vietnam was General William Westmoreland, and Westmoreland had asked him for another 200,000 troops, and Johnson turned him down that day, March 31st, 68. And he also made a public appeal to the leaders of North Vietnam to begin to enter into negotiations about a truce and ending the war. There is still a lot to be said about why this happened. One of the great historians of America right now is a guy named Robert Caro, C-A-R-O. I've mentioned him before. He's doing a magnificent series of books on the Johnson presidency. Caro is about the most detailed historian the United States has ever had. And when he studies somebody, he studies somebody. And he's done, he's in the midst of doing this work on Johnson. I really hope to see someday a full piece he does on Johnson's resignation and what was going through his head. Johnson has been greatly vilified, and there are many reasons to vilify him. On the other hand, there is an argument to be made here that Johnson did this because he saw the country being torn apart. The anti-war protests were really beginning to ramp up and become nationally divisive. People were really getting almost violent on each side of the anti-war protests. He also saw that the war in Vietnam was destroying his Great Society program. And in the next video or two, I'm going to talk about the Great Society. He was spending, it has been calculated, over $300,000 for each enemy soldier he killed in Vietnam. So it was costing him $300,000 or more for each enemy soldier that he was taking down in Vietnam. But his Great Society programs were getting just $50 for each person they helped. $50 versus $300,000. That's not the sort of legacy he wanted to leave. Johnson, as I'll talk about when we do the Great Society, was a big fan of the New Deal and saw the Great Society as a fulfillment of Roosevelt's New Deal ideas. Well, when you're spending, not 10 times, not 100 times, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 times as much on killing people as you are on helping people, this doesn't add up. So Johnson may have wanted to restore a sense of national unity, wanting to bring the country together that was beginning to be ripped apart by all of the strife that was going on in America, and thought that he couldn't accomplish this, or that maybe by stepping down, this could get accomplished. Unfortunately, it doesn't. We will talk about later on the assassinations and the mess that occurs at the end of the 60s, but I just want to finish out Vietnam here as part of the Cold War. What ultimately happens, of course, the Richard Nixon, who had been defeated for president in 1960, comes back in 1968 as the Republican candidate and wins. He wins the presidency, oddly enough, and this is remember, Nixon's reputation was as Mr. Anti-Communism, Mr. Anti-Communist fighter from back as soon as he was elected to Congress after the Second World War. But he is elected in '68 because he promises to end the Vietnam War. He claims to have a plan for peace with honor, as it was called, that they would honorably end the war and bring it to a peaceful end. So on the one hand, he was appealing, Nixon was truly trying to appeal to two groups of people. First of all, he was appealing to the more conservative elements in America, and there were plenty of them out there, who had it with the hippies, the protests, what was viewed as the anti-American, anti-patriotic attitude of many, the free love and the drugs and the protesters and all of the urban rioters and all of that sort of thing. So there were people who were kind of fed up with that, sort of on the conservative end. And there were a great many people in the middle of the political spectrum who by that time, they weren't going to go out for a sit-in with a bunch of student protesters, but the middle of the roaders didn't like the Vietnam War either. And so they wanted America out of Vietnam. They wanted a nice, good, peaceful withdrawal, and Nixon was sort of promising them both. He would restore law and order in an America that had riots in the cities and that had kids protesting in the streets. He would restore law and order, and yet at the same time, he would get us out of Vietnam and bring peace to the world and peace with honor. And people, that appealed to enough people that he won the presidency. It also helped that the Democrats were so badly divided. Over on the left wing, any opposition that would have come to Nixon was so split up and divided and fighting within itself that they couldn't put up an effective fight against Nixon. And so Nixon wound up winning. I'm going to move a little ahead of here of what your reading is in the book, but I want to end it. The way Nixon found forward was a thing called Vietnamization. Vietnamization was really putting the Vietnam War back into the hands of the South Vietnamese. So the theory was, it was sold as, we weren't abandoning the struggle against communism. We weren't losing. Americans had gone into the war initially to train the South Vietnamese to handle it on their own. We had started fighting the war for them, and so now we're going to stop fighting the war for them, and we're slowly going to withdraw and let the Vietnamese take it over again on their own. The peace talks that had been going on in Paris, known as the Paris peace talks, really didn't go anyplace. The North Vietnamese would not give up on their belief that it was right to have a united Vietnam under a communist government, and so they weren't going to give in. And the United States was not about to turn over South Vietnam to them. We still had 500,000 soldiers over there, and by the time Nixon takes over, there were over 31,000 men who had already died. So Nixon and his national security advisor, who was really the mastermind of this, Henry Kissinger, decided that they would continue to negotiate with the North Vietnamese to get a peace settlement while they were gradually withdrawing American soldiers from South Vietnam and letting South Vietnamese soldiers replace them. It took from 1970, when Nixon becomes president, from 69, when Nixon becomes president, to 1973. It takes that long for this process to happen. Finally, the United States and the North Vietnamese sign a treaty called the Paris Peace Accords. The U.S. promised to withdraw its soldiers within the next 2 months. At the same time, the North Vietnamese would release the American prisoners of war they were holding. Over the course of the war, the North Vietnamese had gotten their hands on 600 American prisoners of war. And most of those prisoners of war, by the way, were officers. They were pilots who had been shot down over North Vietnam, and some of them had been held for many years. The Paris Peace Accords brought relief to the United States. Those of us who were alive at the time remember when they were signed, because as they were being signed, the first Americans who had been released by the North Vietnamese were returned, and we remember the simultaneous television shots of of Paris and midnight Paris time when it went into effect, and the shots of the planes arriving with American servicemen on it and getting off the plane and seeing their families for the first time in years after incredibly torturous conditions in North Vietnam. It was a big deal. Within 2 months, by the end of March of 73, the last American troops were leaving, and it gave people a sense of relief with this illusion that nobody really believed, that the United States, that we hadn't lost Vietnam, that we had done our best to hold the communists back. In fact, as soon as the Americans had withdrawn, the war flared up again. And just to end it off, by March 75, the North Vietnamese launch a full-scale attack on the South. And by the end of April, they are surrounding Saigon in the South. The other picture that we remember from that era, if I can pull it up for you, is this one. Um, the This is the roof of the American embassy in Saigon. When the United States withdrew its troops from South Vietnam, we maintained an embassy there, and we also had CIA guys continuing to work there. And in March of '75, so this is 2 years after the Americans left, the North Vietnamese came in, swooped down through the south, surrounded Saigon, and closed in, and people who knew that they would be, and there were a lot of people, some just wanted to get out of South Vietnam because they feared what would happen. Some wanted to get out of South Vietnam because they knew they would be targets of the communists in the north. For whatever reason, they would be political targets or personal targets. And they were incredibly desperate to get out. And everybody, again, who was alive at the time remembers this picture. This is a photo of one of the very last helicopters. It reached the point where the only place where the helicopters could land, the only way to get out of Vietnam was by helicopter, and the only place where the helicopter could land was on the roof of the American embassy. And they were taking these people, shoving them in the helicopter, and taking the helicopters offshore to American aircraft carriers. And when the helicopters would land on the aircraft carriers, if they were damaged in any way, they would just shove them off the side of the aircraft carrier because they didn't have time to fix them or anything else. They were so desperately trying to ferry people out of that country as the communist army moved in. The Vietnam War, just again to finish it off, left a whole lot of legacies. First of all, it was a major American defeat. As much as they tried to play this as the United States was not defeated, everybody saw it as that. And in the midst of the Cold War, this was a victory for the communists. And yet the war, the tone of the Cold War had changed. No longer was it necessarily heroic and mighty to be fighting the communists all over the world. A lot of the troops were seen as part of this sort of sinister American imperialism, as it was called, that was out, almost that we were as bad as the Russians by trying to force Americanism down other people's throats. And so it's a terrible thing, but a lot of the soldiers, when they returned from Vietnam, were not treated well. People took out their anger against the Nixon administration and the Johnson administration against the individual soldiers. And they were called baby killers, and they were all assumed to be war criminals, and a lot of them had a very difficult time when they got back to America. They were not treated as heroes. In the end, the United States lost 58,000 men in Vietnam, and it took many years before people started building monuments to them or acknowledging their heroism. An awful lot of more guys were physically and mentally wounded by the war. The Vietnam War also created skepticism about government in general. People felt that they had been lied to by the government about it, and in its own way shoved America back into a weird kind of isolationism. Because it had been such a failure, people feared getting involved in world conflicts otherwise. Even today, there is, the analogy is always Vietnam. If we get involved in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, will this be another Vietnam? The fear that we could get into a war that we can't win, or a war that we don't really understand. Part of the problem in Vietnam was we really didn't understand the people, and we didn't understand the conflict. We certainly didn't understand the tactics well. American Army was built to fight vast land warfare in Europe. It was not built to fight small warfare in the jungles of Asia. Are we really properly equipped and trained for it? These questions that come up whenever America gets involved around the world today are partially a legacy of Vietnam. It also it created a kind of resurgence of conservatism. The reaction against those who had been the reaction of those. Well, I'll just mention it now. We'll talk about it when you get back to class. But Nixon depended a lot on what he called the silent majority. That is, the average Americans, the ones who were not protesting out in the streets, the ones who were not going to the sit-ins and all that. The backlash against the hippies and the anti-war activists and the anti-poverty activists and the anti-civil rights activists created, in part, the conservative movement. People got so tired or fed up or offended by those that it really began to push America into a more conservative attitude. The war also, of course, damaged Johnson's reputation. He had wanted to be seen as the man of the Great Society, the guy who would make America a more just place, a more anti-poverty place, and a guy who would support civil rights, and he's not. People saw him as Johnson of the war. The chant during the anti-war protests was, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today? That was, what his legacy was going to turn out to be, justly or unjustly. It also damaged Nixon. Instead of being seen as the great guy who finally brought peace to Vietnam, he in many ways, a lot of people think of Vietnam, oddly, as Nixon's war. Well, I talked about Vietnamization before, turning it over to the South Vietnamese Army. Well, that was the initial idea. But when that didn't really seem to be panning out so well, Nixon sort of turned on a dime and said, well, then let's escalate the war, and announced that he was going to send more American troops over there instead of withdrawing them, particularly to send them into Cambodia. Now, Cambodia is over here, and it was a sovereign, independent country, different people, different language, not Vietnamese, and you had Laos up here. And Nixon said, well, you had this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I should get that. You had this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was not, it wasn't like a railroad or something, but it was a method by which the Viet Cong in South Vietnam were being resupplied and reinforced and rearmed constantly by the North Vietnamese. So the North Vietnamese would send stuff down by courier down through the jungles of Laos and Cambodia. So Nixon initially saying, well, we're going to pull out of Vietnam, but the way, now he's saying, by 1970, the way we're going to pull out of Vietnam is by putting more guys in first. To put U.S. troops in Cambodia to try to cut that off, and to bomb. this this turned the war into Nixon's war, if you will, and really damaged his legacy. You'll read in your books, you should have already, I hope, the Kent State quote massacre. The Nixon's action really ramped up again anti-war protests. Oddly enough, even though he had been elected as the anti-war president, and in Kent State University, which is one of the public universities in Ohio, you had a bunch of kids who went out protesting this. They sent in National Guard soldiers to contain the protesters. A lot of stupid things happened that day, and these National Guard kids, really untrained, didn't know what the hell they were doing, opened fire on what were their fellow students in many cases. And you had 4 kids at Kent State who were killed. That sent shockwaves through the nation. Now we're killing our very own kids right here on our own American campuses because they are dissenting from the actions of a president who said he was going to get us out of Vietnam, but is doing it by getting us more deeply involved and bringing in other countries. That triggered these massive 100,000 person anti-war protests in Washington, and the city of Washington came under almost siege. I mean, it was really frightening. There were moments that people thought that we might have a national revolution as a result of this anti-war stuff. So when talking about the legacy of the Vietnam War, it also tainted Nixon and kind of began to weaken his reputation in the opinion of many. Okay, so I just wanted to get through Vietnam there. I'll pick up in the next video with the issues of civil rights and Great Society.